Welcome back to the Environmental Law Monitor. I'm your host, Daniel Pope. This podcast is brought to you by Bracewell LLP's Environment, Lands, and Resources Practice Group, and it's a place for thoughtful conversations. We have conversations ranging from the latest developments to perennial topics like litigation, enforcement, and compliance assurance. We're glad you're spending some time with us today. All right, welcome back. If you are tuning in to my conversation with Stephen Cook, and this is the first time you've heard us talk about MTBE and PFAS, do go back and listen to the first episode. Unless you, like Stephen, are already an expert on the MTBE wars. That was a very helpful conversation. Stephen, I really enjoyed learning more about the history of that controversy. I've heard it alluded to here and there, in my time as an attorney, but I've never actually had a sit-down conversation where somebody helped me understand the dynamics, the players, the issues that were involved. And so what we're going to do today is, having set the table, we're going to talk a little bit about the themes that sort of we see with MTBE that we can apply forward to PFAS, and how governments, industry, stakeholders, and the rest of us can understand and respond to the widespread use of PFAS. We were talking about it a little bit on the last episode. This is in our pots and pans. This is in our rain jackets and our technical apparel, right? Like, how much PFAS might have been left on Mount Everest by, people brushing up against rocks and all that sort of thing. But PFAS is everywhere. MTBE at one point was everywhere. And I think, as we talked about, that sort of presents unique challenges for how a society with all of its institutions responds to something when we learned that there's a long tail adverse consequence to use of that product. And so let's pick up there and sort of reset and talk about what sort of makes PFAS similar to MTBE.
Sure. And being a lawyer, I should probably have issued in the last episode a little bit of a disclaimer. Recognize that with regards to MTBE, there are all sorts of nuances and details that, due to the nature of the broadcast, et cetera, we can't get into.
That's right.
There are generalizations. So those of you who are experts and lived through the MTBE litigation and such, yes, there's a lot I'm glossing over and things, but there's some general principles that you can draw from it. And one of them is decide, how are you going to deal with the litigation? How are you going to deal with the product? What is your approach? Are you going to defend it on all fronts everywhere? Are you going to concede the field? Are you going to withdraw when the fuels producers opted out of buying any more MTBE after the legislation changed? My former employer was left with a choice. What do we do with the equipment? Not going to sell MTBE to the US market. And what was interesting is Europe had come to a different conclusion, as had Asia, with regards to worrying about MTBE. They loved it because it was helping them with environmental issues. They also at that time had double cold tanks for many years, so they didn't have the leakage problem. So they'd solved the storage problem. Therefore, their minds, MTBE was fine.
Are we seeing something like that? And not to put you on the spot as an expert in environmental law in the international context, but are we seeing other governments? I don't know. Have you paid attention to any governments and how what Europe is doing with PFAS? Are we seeing sort of similar? Are we seeing divergent approaches in different contexts?
There is with regard to the health effects. Everybody seems to agree and be on the same page. We should limit it getting out into the water.
Right.
Not good. But at what levels is it harmful? I mean, EPA has sent out a health advisory level that is impossible to measure at those concentrations. They are well in the parts per quadrillion level. Europe seems to be not jumping quite as fast to those kind of levels of being levels of concern. So you do see different approaches. Everybody talks about science. The prior administration got hammered a lot that we didn't follow the science. And that really means now with an EPA is more, you didn't follow the process. The process has become the science in many ways. And when you talk about health effects, it isn't just a direct measurement aspect. It isn't something you just go stick out a thermometer, you know what the temperature is. You observe, you conduct a test that isn't anything like the real world on whether it's animals or a model or whatever, and you come up with something you can measure, and then you translate that into a potential health effect on humans. Mm-hmm. And during that translation process, there are a lot of judgment calls that get made. Some cases, because we don't know much, they just divide by 10. That's how they've come up with the best scientists. But those are really judgment/policy calls. Mm-hmm. And so that's when you start weighing different things. Some compounds, there's clearly, it's zero. You just can't have it. Lead's one of those, whereas pretty universal. Everybody agrees there's no safe level of lead. But getting lead to zero is not possible in some cases. So you try to go as low as, borrowing a term from the safety world, as low as reasonably practicable.
Right.
So PFAS, there's not a consensus as to what is a safe level. And the science doesn't dictate the answer. If you go conservative on every single assumption, you will be at, okay, it's zero. Well, okay, what do you do with that? As a company or as a regulator, you just ban it? Okay, then what? How useful is that for making decisions of balancing all the other different priorities you've got? I asked the chair of the Science Advisory Board one time, I said, look, we have run the human exposure experiment. If you look at the data that's available, most Americans, if not most people in any type of advanced society, have some of these chemicals in their bloodstream. If they have it and you can measure it, it's above the health advisory levels that EPA just put out. If they were really huge health effects, shouldn't we see that in the epidemiology data? Shouldn't we be able to see whatever it is that we're concerned about, see upticks and tease that out of the data? And he said you should, but it's not easy, but it could be doable. I've not seen anybody actually do that, but that's something we have conducted the experiment. They pull out the polar ice caps and they look at the ice up there and they find these compounds up there at these levels. So it's everywhere. And that's one of the differences from MTBE. How do you, if you wanted to eliminate it tomorrow from the environment, how do you do that? Whereas MTBE, you had a discrete number of producers. You knew the source was coming from the fuel. You could just change that reformulation and then you're done. And there are traces out there. But once again, when you're dealing at levels in part per billion, part per million, you can leave a little bit behind and everything's okay. But if you're supposed to get to where if you measure it, it's got to go, that's a tough standard to meet and may impact what you do about it. So that's the science struggle and the process. There is not I view true science as the ability to go and accurately measure something and report it. And there's no doubt that at 100 degrees C, standard atmospheric pressure, water will boil. That's a given. There's not a lot of things like that when you talk about health effects. And so we call it science, but it's science policy. Yeah. It's science judgment.
Yeah. You can't at any point, I mentioned that I taught history. One of the things that I would always talk about when we were talking about economics was that you can look at economic information, but that doesn't tell you what to do with that economic information, right? That's something that we see right now. Hey, how are we going to address inflation? Well, there are things that we know that we could do that maybe would help it, but we still don't know what we ought to do. Maybe we should just stay the course, right? And that's true with science as well. You can learn a lot about a chemical and the way it affects the human body, but when you start talking about setting health thresholds or whatever, that also inherently involves, just judgment calls and value judgments.
Right. And it's because like PFAS, there's a lot of good that it does.
Right.
And the products that it's in at these very low concentrations. And so you're talking about reformulating all sorts of different products and things if you were to just ban all uses of it.
That's right.
So those are the challenges. And that's what a regulatory agency is struggling with. And why you see EPA as being very aggressive, because obviously if it's in the water, or it's in the soil, it shouldn't be there. But the FDA is going a little slower because it's doing a good purpose in helping preserve the food, providing safe container. What do they do with it?
Right.
And so they're not quite as anxious because it's doing something good where it is in the containers, keep preserving food, et cetera. And so those are the balances regulatory authorities have to go through. And when you're still struggling to measure, it's really tough to decide what's the right regulatory answer.
And that maybe explains why, at least in the time that I've been an attorney, PFAS has always been the up and coming thing, right? We've been hearing, like I said, I think on the last episode, we've been hearing about forever chemicals forever. And it's been interesting to see developments in that world, but it's also been interesting to see how many stakeholders, when you have something like this that's so widespread, just how many different perspectives are involved and how many different concerns are advanced. One thing I don't think that we talked about very much on the last episode, but when we've sort of talked about the ways that MTBE is similar to and dissimilar from PFAS. But what was the regulatory history like, and sort of where are we at now with PFAS, and does that sort of sync up with what you observed at the time with MTBE?
Well, MTBE, from a regulatory standpoint, it was fascinating to watch. States that didn't use it banned it. So, okay, great.
That was sort of a layup, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. We don't want any MTBE in our state. Okay, fine. Well, it's never been there. So good. But others tried to set up various standards. And so there was some state effort. But when the federal legislation changed, the market opted out of it. It was gone from usage. So then you were into a cleanup mode. But the litigation continued on. In fact, I think there was just a recent settlement, I think, with Rhode Island on MTBE contamination. So the litigation is still there. So with PFAS, it's the trail of liabilities and resolutions is going to be with us for decades.
Yes.
And, you still see the ads for asbestos.
Right. On
the TV. You will see some type of thing for PFAS for many decades. And that's where I think you look at companies trying to figure out what their strategy is, trying to figure out what they do. Now, once again, with MTBE, it was a discrete number of companies, fuel providers and such. PFAS, there's a discrete number that are heavy users of it, but at the part per trillion level, it's in retail clothing. You're seeing, consumer product warning lawsuits and such on, REI for, as you said in the last episode, up on Mount Apparel you wear up to Mount Everest.
Yeah.
We really like that being waterproof if you're up there at 20 below,
Right.
It's really good to have that in there. And so your first challenge as a company is to figure out, do I have this material in my supply chain somewhere? Or am I passing along? And for industrial facilities, is it in the water that I'm using and then discharging back out? You may not be including it, but it may be in the water you're intaking. If there was a time where many of the chemical plants along the ship channel were actually cleaning the river and the channel because the water they were discharging was cleaner than what they brought in as it went through the process and such and went through their wastewater treatment plant. I don't know if that's still the case now with all the improvements that have been made and such, but that's another question. Is it in my products? Is it somewhere in my supply chain? And for manufacturing operations, is it in like my water discharge?
Yeah.
And you need to figure that out. Now, there was a time when I was a young lawyer, we talked about sampling, and the phrase we often use is no sample would be taken before its time. There was an old TV commercial about wine that no wine would be, bottle would be open before its time. And that time being, are you ready to deal with it? You're going to get an answer when you sample. This is one of those science things, real science. You go and measure. Right. And now I have a number.
Now you have information.
What do I do with it?
Right.
And so there was a thought many years ago that you didn't want to know until you had to know. I think we're long past that now. A couple decades, we're past that. You have to know, because if you don't know, others will know.
That's right.
NGOs, the sampling has gotten cheaper, more prevalent. Somebody's going to sample for you. I mean, they go out to landfills and pull their wastewater discharge and take samples and such. That is something you've got to deal with. So you need to know. Your first task is really to figure out, do I have it?
Right. And that's a little bit different, it strikes me, from MTBE, where if you were sort of in a particular universe, maybe you produced MTBE or you incorporated it into gasoline, or maybe you sold the gasoline, right? And helped, ran the pump on the corner, you were probably on notice. Hey, I may have this stuff and I should check for leaks. I should think about what my exposure is here. It strikes me that PFAS is very different in that regard, in the sense that, and I think you said this on the last episode, like somebody may be using one of the, thousands of compounds in the PFOA family and not even really be aware of it.
Right. Their supplier may be putting it in and it's at such low concentrations, it doesn't show up on any safety data sheet. There's no disclosure requirement in the contract. So for some folks, it will take some time to really understand, is it in my supply chain? Now, you're going to have plaintiffs lawyers now who are very well funded from all their successes we talked about last time.
That's right.
This is their business model. They will help you go find it. They will go find it for you.
Right.
We're seeing now they're going after, I think Coca-Cola on Simply Juice, that the PFAS in the container is getting into the product and into the all natural drink.
I think that, every once in a while you'll see a report where someone has done sort of a deep dive finding PFAS and, hey, it's over here too. Come read this article and see what your exposure is like. And you can look up now, basically, like, is PFAS in my favorite beverage? And you can figure out, what the ppm is on average in what you drink. That's been a really big deal for a lot of different companies that make soft drinks and might not think that they need to be paying attention all the time to what's going on at EPA. right? Like there are going to be a lot of people that are going to be dealing with EPA and with state environmental agencies that it may be the first time that they deal with those agencies.
Yes, those rules will have consequences far outside the normal, typical people who view themselves as regulated by the environmental agency. And likewise, it impacts your business. You need to look at, the contracts. What specs do you have? Do you want to put a spec in your contracts of no PFAS? And how do you enforce that? What kind of testing you require from your suppliers? What if your customers come to you and ask for, hey, we want a no PFAS product from you? What kind of indemnity are you going to give? What kind of product guarantee are you willing to do? If you do find you have PFAS, do you have a substitute? Can you eliminate it? And will that be accepted by your marketplace?
Right.
Or do you want to stay in the business? 3M has announced they're getting out of the production business. So they're done. The liabilities won't be done for a long time, but they're not going to produce any new material. So those are all the kind of decisions that the legal department has got to help the business gather the information and get together and figure out what's their strategy, both for the business side and also from the litigation side. How are you going to handle litigation? Are you fighting everything? Are you looking to find reasonable settlements quickly? Just like any other liability, there's different ways to handle it, but you need to be thinking about it now and setting up your strategies, setting up your defense teams or offense teams, depending upon what side you are, and be prepared to either execute your strategy or start executing it. It may be time. Maybe you get proactive, but there's a series of questions you need to be asking yourself about that and come up with the plan because it's coming. If it hasn't already hit you, it likely will if these molecules are anywhere in your supply chain.
We also talked a little bit about when companies decided to switch away from using MTBE to oxygenate their fuels, they had a ready alternative that was used in a region of the country, and then everyone switched to it, and then it became included in the renewable fuel standard, right? Ethanol. And so that also made it possible for folks to get out of the game if they wanted to, right? Because there wasn't that kind of pressure that we may be seeing with some uses of PFAS, where there's, we talked about the firefighting foams or the advanced firefighting foams. There's not a great alternative yet. I've seen alternatives for cookware, right? But PFAS is used in so much that there are going to be so many alternatives that have to be developed and deployed, and that will be interesting to see how quickly companies are able to do that.
It will be. And the Department of Defense has wanted to be out of the AFFF using business for many years, but they have not found the substitute that can put out that fire in so many seconds.
That's right.
And they really like putting the fires out.
Yes.
And so, they cut out the training. They don't train with AFFF anymore. You've got non-PFAS foams that act very similarly. So the training can still be effective. But the actual product, they finally have come out with a military specification for the non-fluorine formula. And so they're heading down that road. But this has been a many-year effort to try to find that replacement. And I don't know what that looks like for other business lines, but that's something you need to think about your business. If it's critical what PFAS is doing for you, do you need to start devoting more research to that replacement? What is going to work, or talking to your customers about some type of reformulation that is close to providing whatever property is that you're wanting the product to have, but may not be exact, but is it good enough so that both of you can get out of having PFAS in the supply chain and such? So it's not just a legal question, but the legal strategy is a key part of the business strategy. And that's what I took away from MTBE, is that we sat down with the business and talked through how we were managing the legal strategies. Because for a long time, the producers of MTBE and the producers of the fuels were together and worked with each other, and joint defense agreements and things like that, trying to focus on, it was the tanks. They leaked. That's the issue. Fix the tanks. This problem is solved, and we can deal with the cleanup. There are technologies to clean up MTBE, and we can get there. But those alliances didn't last forever, particularly when the liability protection didn't show up, the legislation changes. All of a sudden, the producers of gasoline are not on the same page as the producers of the independent chemical companies anymore. Right. There was a split. And so then, do you want to be more aggressive in enforcing contractual indemnities or such? But those are all part of your business/legal strategy that you need to talk through as a company.
It seems like this is a pretty sophisticated question as compared to, is this material hazardous waste or not? And what should I do to containerize and dispose of that appropriately, right? Like that's a question that you can wrap your mind around. But it does seem like this requires a pretty sophisticated approach that considers, what's your business going to use instead of it, right? How are you going to consider and manage your liabilities in connection with previous uses of PFAS in your products, in the chemicals that you may be producing, and so on and so forth? Where have you allocated risk in your contractual agreements with your suppliers or your purchasers of your products? And which contracts have those protections and which don't, and where the risk is there. So it seems like this isn't just a question of tactics. It's a question of really an intelligent strategy to be deployed on several fronts to help a business sort of navigate PFAS litigation, changing regulations, and so on and so forth, changing uses of materials. And it seems like you would be a pretty good person to talk to, having been there when it happened with MTBE. And it strikes me that there's some interesting overlaps and some notable divergences. And even those differences can help inform a company and what they do next in this issue.
Another key aspect of this is insurance.
Mm-hmm.
What are your insurance policies? What are your product liability policies or your pollution exclusion clauses in insurance policy? When I was a young lawyer, that was one of the big debates, is whether the pollution exclusion clause of the 1972 Comprehensive General Liability insurance policies covered Superfund or excluded it or not, and the intentional discharge versus unintentional, et cetera. But you want to look at that, because there was a strategy in the 80s and 90s when there was a lot of environmental coverage available to where companies gave great indemnities. I was the beneficiary in one case of a wonderful indemnity. Basically, every molecule was covered of this particular compound because the company that gave us the indemnity at that time had this great portfolio of insurance. So there wasn't a lot of risks to them. Well, in the meantime, they had bought out the insurance. So the insurance coverage is gone now, and the indemnity still sits there.
Right. And
so that worked well to my advantage in that case. But that's something, once again, that's a business strategy that plays into how you set up your litigation strategy, your litigation defense. What does your insurance portfolio look like? And the insurance carriers will start pushing back and you'll start seeing PFAS exclusions or other type of riders on the insurance, limiting their coverage for the difference between intentional use or addition versus unintentional. Maybe one place where that starts dividing up. But that's a key part that's got to be part of your discussion is where's the insurance portfolio and protecting us on this?
Well, Stephen, it's been great to have you. I think one of the things that I've taken away from this is that all the strategies you've been talking about deploying all depend on a company knowing whether it has PFAS in its supply chain, PFAS and its products, and so on and so forth. And in this case, what you don't know can hurt you. And so I think that is well taken. There's so many attorneys, agencies advising companies to do this, right? Like check where you are with respect to PFAS. But I do think that is one area where if you haven't done it yet, please go evaluate your supply chain and your products to determine what your exposure is. And then maybe call up my colleague Stephen here to have a sophisticated and entertaining conversation about what you can do to respond to whatever it is you discover. So thank you, Stephen. Thank you for coming back on. And I'm sure we'll be talking soon about these and sundry other topics.
Well, thanks for having me. And for those who want further details, I can always regale you with stories of sitting in a courtroom in Syracuse watching MTBE get hammered in front of a federal judge for days. Those were fun times. So it's a fascinating area. As I used to say in the agency, PFAS was a 4-letter word. CCR was a 4-letter word, despite only having 3 letters. It's a difficult, complex issue. It's a lot of fun to try to dive in and get all the different diverse pieces put together and figure out how you're going to go forward. And what's different this time is the ease with which other people are going to help you figure this out. They're going to get information. They're going to find this material, and they're going to come and ask for help, whether it's money or ban your product, whatever. But it's just not something you can hope it goes away. It's here and has to be dealt with.
That's it for us today at the Environmental Law Monitor. Big thanks to our guests, as well as Dorn, Emily, and Austin, and the rest of our production team who helped to make this episode possible. And of course, thank you, our listeners, and we'll talk to you soon.